So my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
Shoot it, please shoot it! Oh, no! Close the door!
Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot in the head. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me right at this moment. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. They have the gun away from the man.
On June 5th, my sister came into my bedroom at 7 o'clock in the morning, and she said Robert Kennedy was shot. And I was 10. I was devastated. I thought Sirhan was the killer. And for many years I thought he was the killer, but I started reading books, and the more I read, the more I thought to myself, there's more to the story than what's being told.
Sirhan, this is a question that I think the doctors asked you several times. If you had 3 wishes now, what would they be?
I wish that Senator Kennedy was still alive. I wish that every day that I've been here. Second one, that there should be peace in the Middle East.
I met Bill Pepper through a mutual friend, and Bobby Kennedy is my hero and has been since I've been a little kid. And Bill was impressed that I knew enough about, as much as I did, about the assassination, and I was in awe of Bill's knowledge. We met a couple of times, and then he said to me, I'm thinking about getting involved in this case, would you like to join? And it was, I didn't have to even hesitate. I said yes, of course. And 11 years later, we're still working on it. So I went to meet Sirhan at Corcoran Prison, and when I met him, he was very soft-spoken, very, very quiet, polite, and very articulate. And he's one of the kindest people I've met. And one of the first things that Sirhan said to me was, if something happens to me in here, I didn't do it.
Hi, I'm Dan Brown. I've been an associate clinical professor in psychology at Harvard Medical School. I've been on the faculty at Harvard for 38 years now. So I've written 18 books. One of the books is called Memory, Trauma, Treatment, and the Law. It's a standard textbook on how people remember trauma and how one does non-suggestive investigative interviews. I got involved in the case through my business partner at my private practice, whose name is Howard Behrens, a psychiatrist. And Howard Behrens had worked on as the psychiatrist for James Earl Ray for a number of years, and after seeing him for over a decade, was convinced that he was not the assassin for Martin Luther King. And he was working on a case with a lawyer by the name of Bill Pepper. And when Bill Pepper got interested in the Bobby Kennedy assassination and reopening it, Howard asked me whether I'd be interested in seeing Sirhan and doing non-suggestive interviewing to see whether I could find out what happened. So I've seen him for over 100, 150 hours over the last 11 years, and tried to find out what we could about what happened. When I first met Sirhan, he seemed somewhat clueless about what had happened the night of the assassination. He doesn't remember very much, and except what he was told by others.
So what do you remember about the shooting, if you're willing to talk about that?
Obviously I was there, but I don't remember the exact moment. I don't remember pulling my gun out of my body or whatever it was located, and I don't remember aiming it at any human being. I don't remember any of that, Mr. Frisbee. And I've said that from the get-go.
My first impression was not favorable of the prison, because they blocked us for a year from seeing him, and the attorney, Laurie Dusek, and myself went to see him after about a year. It took us to get permission to go see him, and they put us in a room with him behind plexiglass with a phone that didn't work right in front of the guard station so they could watch over us. And they brought him in shackles after going through about 30 heavy gates. And I told them that that was not acceptable to me, and that we wanted him to be taken out of the shackles, and leg and arm shackles, and being treated somewhat humanly, and that they ought to give us a room that had a phone that worked so we could actually talk with him after waiting a year to see him.
I had never seen anybody hypnotized before. Sirhan went under so quickly the first time. Dan just asked him to count from 10 backwards. And the first time I think he might have gotten to number 3 before he was under. The other times he didn't get past like 7 and he was under. Amazing to watch.
Sirhan's one of the most suggestible people I've ever met. You can get him to do anything in hypnosis and he doesn't remember, so he's the perfect candidate. In fact, Bernie Diamond did this experiment where just before the trial, in front of a number of reporters, he hypnotized Sirhan and gave him a suggestion that when he woke up, sometime after, Bernie would pull out a handkerchief. And when Sirhan saw that handkerchief, he would have the urge to climb up the bars of his cell. So after 45 minutes, he pulls out his handkerchief in front of these 2 reporters, and Sirhan climbs up to the top of the cell, and he's hanging on the bars, and Bernie says to him casually, "What are you doing up there?" He says, "Oh, I'm just exercising." He had no idea that he was responding compulsively to a hypnotic suggestion, a post-hypnotic suggestion.
Dan did things like when you wake up, it'll be hard to say your name. Something little like that. And the reason he did it, because Sirhan didn't believe that he was under hypnosis. So we needed something so when Sirhan came out of it, we could prove to him that he had been hypnotized. Sirhan thought that Dan was a kook. He didn't believe, like, you could hypnotize me and this, and he couldn't grasp the concept of the Manchurian Candidate. He just couldn't. And it took us a while to convince him that he wasn't guilty. Because Grant Cooper told him he did it. And after all those years of being told he did it, Sirhan believed that he did it.
I'm not mentally ill, sir, but I'm not perfect either.
The first thing that I tried to focus on for the first couple of meetings was what was wrong with him in terms of psychiatric conditions, if anything. A Rorschach inkblot was given to him before the trial, and both the defense and the prosecution experts concurred that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. But that was challenged later when he went to San Quentin and was convicted, and he was on death row, because the psychiatrist at San Quentin said that he didn't see any signs of him being schizophrenic. So he asked his chief psychologist, whose name was Dr. Simpson Callis, to be more involved and spend time with Sirhan, and he spent 20 to 30 hours of time and drew the conclusion that there was nothing psychiatrically wrong with Sirhan except that he was highly hypnotizable, and speculated that Sirhan might be a Manchurian Candidate and had been programmed to be a distractor for that night.
What is your own hypothesis on what happened?
My own hypothesis is that there have to be other people involved. Someone had to set him up. He would be the ideal person for the purpose, because he could be exploited with the background of Jewish-Arab intense conflict. He is the ideal person because he's a follower, essentially. I was a company commander in World War II. That's the kind of man I would have wanted in my unit. He follows orders, he's willing to die. He doesn't ask even many questions.
He thought that Sirhan was highly hypnotizable and that should be followed up further, which is one of the reasons why I was asked to be involved in the case, because I've written 4 textbooks on hypnosis.
The Rorschach test. The things that the patient's imagination sees in these cards give significant clues to his personality makeup.
The evaluation of Sirhan was based on a Rorschach that was given to him in 1968, and that was before we had modern scientific methods to score up the Rorschach inkblot test. When you give the inkblots to somebody who potentially has a disorganized mind, like a schizophrenic, when they describe what they see, they get more and more disorganized in response to the ambiguous stimuli. So you can score up the number of ways that they show manifestations of disorganized thinking. It was originally called a thought disorder index.
This looks sort of like a drawing of 2 women standing on a rock and waving their hands.
I gave the Rorschach inkblot test to Sirhan as one of the first things I did, and scored it up with the thought disorder index. And there was also another streamlined scoring system that came out some years later called the Exner Special Scores. I scored up both of those tests, both of those scoring systems with the Rorschach that I administered to Sirhan. And they were completely clean. He had no evidence of thought disorder whatsoever, so he couldn't be schizophrenic by current standards. Therefore, I gave the Rorschach protocol, sent it to an expert blind without telling who it was, and asked for an independent opinion, and he said it was completely clean. Then, not knowing that it still existed, I found a copy of the original Rorschach protocol that was used before the trial, and I scored it up both with the longer thought disorder index and the shorter Eckner special scores, and again, it was clean. So I gave it to the expert blind, and he said it was clean. And so we got 4 tests, both given 47 years later, and at the time of the trial, this guy was never schizophrenic, never met any scientific standard of being schizophrenic. And that raised the question about the inaccuracies of the diagnosis at the trial. They were just grossly wrong. He also has a dissociative coping style, and he is on the Go-Johnson compliancy scale. He scored quite high, which means he goes along with what people suggest to him. He's not very memory suggestible, which means that you can't suggest to him things that will change his memory very much. His memory suggestibility is quite low, which means he's been exposed to so many different opinions over the years that doesn't get him to alter his memory or come up with false memories.
And can you explain what dissociative coping style means for the lay person?
It means that when he's under stress, he tends to compartmentalize things. There's a part of the mind that doesn't know what's going on, and there's another part of the mind that sort of knows but isn't available. And he scored extremely high in dissociative coping style. Now, the reason why that's important is because if you want to train somebody to do something outside of their knowledge, they have to be highly hypnotizable, they have to be highly compliant, and they have to be able to dissociate that knowledge away from consciousness. He scores very high in those 3 personality characteristics, so he's the perfect candidate for Manchurian Candidate training. Other than that, there's nothing else wrong with him. I did all these psychological tests on him, including tests of violence potential, which he was very low on. And having done all those tests, the prison was sort of at a disadvantage for the parole hearings because they didn't know what tests I administered and what I was going to say. But they brought in a psychologist of their own, Dr. Carrera, who didn't know the tests that I used and fortunately did a lot of the same tests, empirically derived, scientifically based tests, and found out that there was nothing wrong with him. She gave the same violence potential risk tests that I gave. She gave some of the same assessments for personality disorders. And their own prison psychologist came up with the independent conclusion that there was nothing psychiatrically wrong with this guy. So Dr. Simpson Callis at San Quentin, myself, and Dr. Carrera now, we have 3 independent opinions all saying the same thing, that there's nothing wrong with this guy psychiatrically, other than the fact that he beats the type of personality characteristics for the kind of person you can do undue suggestive influence with.
Now, open your eyes and look at Kennedy. Where is your gun? Reach for it. Reach for it, Sirhan. Reach for your gun. Let me see you shoot the gun, Sirhan. Shoot the gun. Shoot the gun. Who are you shooting, Sirhan? Who are you shooting? His fingers are going through repetitive spasmodic movements like pulling a trigger on a double-action revolver.
If you look at the old tapes of what Diamond did with Sirhan, he led Sirhan on. He hypnotized him and then pretty much fed him the replies, which is not the way that you hypnotize somebody to get an answer. Dan never led Sirhan on. He would hypnotize him and then just say, Sirhan, I want to take you back to that evening. What do you remember?
I reviewed all the audio tapes from Dr. Diamond's hypnosis with him. It's highly suggestive, and Dr. Diamond had assumed ahead of time that he was the sole assassin. So he was simply suggesting scenarios to him, and Sirhan was quite resistive of those kind of suggestions because he's not that memory suggestible. My approach is I didn't assume anything. I just tried to find out what he would report to us, and then over time reconstruct what had happened as best we could. So having got that background on him, then I did 3 things. First was repeated free recall. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. Tell me more about that. And then, with no suggestions. And then free recall with prompts. You said this, exactly what he said. Tell me more about that. That's the first phase of the interviewing. The second phase of the interviewing was done with what's called the cognitive interview, where you reinstate the context. Imagine yourself back at the target time, put yourself in that situation on the day of such and such, in that such and such setting, and then freely recall from there. There are about 50 peer-reviewed articles on the cognitive interview showing that you can, in a non-suggestive forum, you can get somewhere between 20 and 25% new information about a target event in a non-suggestive way. Then thirdly and lastly, I hypnotized him and then did free recall under hypnosis. So those were the 3 steps in the protocol, so we could preserve the record and show that what he remembered was non-suggested.
And how did you keep a record of these sessions?
Well, the prison wouldn't let us bring in any recording devices. We had to take notes. So what I did is take concurrent notes with everything I did, and Laurie Dusek did notes, and we compared our notes at the end of the day and constructed what we both agreed upon. Almost no information came out, and new information came out in hypnosis. Almost all the information that he was able to report came out under free recall or free recall plus context reinstatement.
Why hadn't you remembered this stuff before? What was the key to your work with him that yielded new information?
No one had ever asked him before. At the trial, everybody assumed that he was the sole assassin, so nobody actually asked him what went on. And he could remember bits and pieces of it, and we put it together over time. He remembered more material over time. But some things are still difficult for him to remember. What Sirhan told me was that he came over to the U.S. as part of a Christian fellowship to be placed with a Christian family in the Los Angeles area, and that he had a sister, I think 3 years younger, who he was very close to, and his sister died of leukemia. And that was very hard on Sirhan. He was 21 at the time, I think.
His interest in the occult occurred after his sister died, and he was at a total loss. The only time I've seen Sirhan cry, when he was talking about his sister's death under hypnosis, he just cried like a baby. It really impacted him. And he said after his sister died, he didn't understand what happened after death. And maybe trying to keep a connection with her, he said he started going to bookstores and reading about the occult.
He wanted to find out whether there was any religious traditions that would support the idea that there was life after death, that his sister would still be available on some plane in reality. So he started reading the theosophical literature, and from there that brought him to the Rosicrucians, and from there that brought him to a self-hypnosis correspondence course through the Rosicrucians that he paid for. And he was hypnotizing himself on a regular basis. At the time he was working as a hot walker and stable boy at Santa Anita Racetrack in Pasadena. And his 2 best friends, Terry Welch and Terry Rafke, were both, the 3 of them were all hypnotizing each other. And it was very obvious that he was not an ordinary hypnotic candidate. He could do unusual, go into a very deep trance very quickly, and he often didn't remember anything he did in hypnosis. So that was sort of the talk of the stable boys. Sirhan always wanted to be a jockey, but he had no experience riding any horses. And then all of a sudden, one of the people part-time at the ranch, whose name was Frankie, called him up out of the blue and offered him a job riding thoroughbreds at a high-end ranch, Corona Racetrack. You don't take a kid who's never ridden a thoroughbred before, give him a $250,000 horse to ride. It makes no sense. And within several weeks, he had a fall from that horse during a foggy day. And now this is where the story gets interesting, because I looked up the medical records, and he was treated in Corona Community Hospital emergency room by a Dr. Nelson, who discharged him 4 hours later from the emergency room with 4 stitches in one eye, that he got in a minor injury from falling off the horse. There was no other injuries other than that eye injury. But Sirhan remembered that he was missing for 2 to 3 weeks, because every weekend he would go back from Corona to stay with his mother and his family in Pasadena. And he was missing for 2 weeks, and his mother and his best friend Terry were desperate to find where he was because he didn't come home. He remembered being on a hospital unit he remembered there was bars on the wall, and there were 6 people from the same 2 ranches with all had head injuries from the same ranch. So what are the odds of that?
In the beginning, he thought he was at the hospital for a day, and then under hypnosis, he started talking and remembering that maybe he'd been there longer. And we figure out he's probably there for about 2 weeks. And he remembers a ward with no windows and maybe 6 to 8 other patients on the ward, all with head injuries.
And doctors would come up with him with clipboards every day, and he remembered drifting in and out of consciousness like he was drugged. He remembers being on the special unit, and the doctors would come up with him with clipboards and take urine samples frequently during the day and ask him about his state of mind. You don't usually give urine samples for head injuries, but you do for drugs. So it looks like he was drugged and put on the special unit, and they determined that he was a good candidate for further training because of his level of hypnotizability.
Well, according to Munir, his brother didn't come back for about 2 weeks. His friend and his mom were concerned where Sirhan was. And they said that it was a great change in his personality. He was more reserved. And when he finally did return home, Munir said that they got into an argument over a cup of tea, which was so unlike Sirhan, because he wasn't the argumentative type at all. So his personality had changed. Before the shooting, he went to the Fish Canyon firing range. And what was unusual that day is Sirhan would usually go to the range, shoot for a little while, and then leave. That particular day, he was there for a few hours. And the range master said the range was closing down, so Sirhan had to leave. He met a friend of Bob's big boy, and actually he regrets because the friend said, hey, let's go shoot some pool. And Sirhan, to this day, says if only he had gone with his friend, none of this would have happened. And so he went into LA, and he went to the Ambassador Hotel because there was another party there. And he had gone to school with a daughter of that candidate. So he thought maybe he'd run into some people there. Sirhan was not a big social butterfly, very withdrawn, very much to himself. And when he was in the Ambassador Hotel, he stopped at the Rafferty party and then noticed that there was a larger party going on, which was the RFK victory party, and so he went there. The interesting thing is he's not a drinker. I think he had alcohol twice before in his life, and he said each time it made him ill. Supposedly he had 4 Tom Collins. And as he was drinking, obviously the drinks affected him because the alcohol went to his head. He thought he could go back home, so he went out to his car, and he was going to drive home, but when he got to his car, he realized that he was too drunk. So he walked back into the Ambassador, and he thought he'd have some coffee and try to sober up. And when he went back in, he ran into this woman who was looking for coffee.
I started searching for coffee. That was all what I wanted to do. And I found some.
In the kitchen area?
But where, I don't remember, sir.
In a kitchen-type room?
I don't remember where I saw it, but I remember getting the cup. It was a shining...
Large urn?
Urn. And there was a girl there. No, I don't remember much what happened after that.
You don't remember?
I don't remember.
Do you remember anything?
Other than the choking and the commotion. I don't remember that.
He gets to his car and he thinks, I can't drive. I need to get some coffee. So he retraces his steps and he goes back to the same bar at the Ambassador Hotel. And sitting at the bar with the bartender now is a very attractive woman with a polka dot dress on. He had never met the girl before, according to his report. And he says to the bartender, where do I get some coffee? And the bartender turns to the woman and says, take him to the urn behind where Kennedy is talking. And she's very attractive, so he's there to pick up girls, so he starts flirting with her. But he's self-conscious. They have coffee. And of course, at the last minute, what happened at this assassination was that the route got changed, originally from going to the press room to going through the kitchen. And it took some time to figure out who changed the route and how would any assassin know that the route was changed. But what Sirhan remembered was, to me, was that a man with a clipboard and a badge on came up to him and said to him and the woman with the polka dot dress, said, you can't stay here, take him to the kitchen. And the woman led him to the kitchen. Then she's sitting on the stacking table and he's flirting with her, but she's very distracted. She keeps looking away like this. He doesn't know why she keeps looking away. And then all these people start coming through the kitchen and she goes like this. And when she pinches him on the arm, he goes into range mode. And the next thing he remembers is people were holding him down and trying to hold his neck down. the next thought was, oh my God, I'm not shooting at circle targets, I just shot somebody. So it sounds like he was programmed to show up that night without even his knowledge, and then to, upon cue, be led to the place of the assassination, go into range mode and be a distractor and shoot wildly. And while he was shooting wildly, the real assassin could professionally take the hit and then leave and let Sirhan take the rap for it. The polka dot dress woman was his handler. He said he never met her before. She was there to show up, to flirt with him, and to take him to the kitchen, and then to induce range mode, so that then she leaves and then the real assassin leaves.
Well, over the course of many, many sessions with Dan, and this is many sessions with Dan, Sirhan recalled that she let him into the kitchen, and at one point she pinched him and turned him around into the direction that the senator was coming. And he went into range mode. He said that she looked very provincial. Her nose was a little unusual. He was attracted to her. He said to me he thought he was going to get lucky that night. I mean, he's a 24-year-old guy, and he saw a woman that he thought was beautiful. And Dan and I laughed. We call it the boob job, because Dan said, Sirhan said, she was well endowed. So he was like a little puppy dog following this woman around.
On May 18th of last year, you were sitting and writing in your room.
They are the writings of a maniac.
They're the writings of Sirhan Sirhan.
Yes, but they're not the writings of me now.
The thing that broke the case wide open was the day after he was accused of being the sole assassin. They went to his house and they found 4 spiral notebooks that were handwriting that looked like his handwriting. A lot of it was nonsensical stuff. But some of the notebooks had inculpatory statements like RFK must die. The master says shoot on command. Killing Kennedy, RFK has become an obsession of mine. And these were mixed in with lots of other things that didn't make a lot of sense. So at one point in the waking state, with instructions for free recall, I simply said to him, did anybody ever give you instructions or commands to shoot on command? And then suddenly Sirhan jumps up like this and takes a shooting posture that was familiar to him at the gun range, and starts citing these military terms that about shooting at human organs, vital human organs like K6 and K9 and K12. And the numbers are military code names for which vital organ you aim at and target. And I'm thinking to myself, you don't take a civilian and teach them how to shoot at vital human organs. This is unusual. And then we found out that we could trigger range mode, and every time we triggered it, we could get him to stand up and start shooting automatically. And he remembered that he was at a target range shooting at circle targets. So we call that behavior range mode behavior. It was a highly dissociative state that was induced in him and he was trained to do, allegedly because he would be a distractor. He would, upon cue, shoot on command, and then everybody would jump him in the kitchen during the Kennedy assassination, and then the real assassin would move in and take the fatal shots, and while the chaos was going on, they would leave and Sirhan would take the rap.
But when Dan hypnotized him, and again, this is not under the first 3 sessions, this is maybe 60 hours on in, he started talking about range mode, and this woman pinched him, which we think was the cue, and literally turned him in the direction that the senator was coming. And he fired. And when he was doing this, he actually got up and reenacted range mode, pulling out a gun and shooting. He followed her into the kitchen because he had no idea where he was going. Again, he thought he was going to get lucky that night, and he was a hot-blooded young male, and he followed her. And I think he would have followed her anywhere. And she brought him on over towards the steam table, pushed up against him, and then pinched him. And he said the pinch hurt. And with that, she turned him around, and it was in the direction of the senator. And he went into range mode. Range mode, he got up, he pulled out a gun, and he went like this. Amazing to see.
And did you see him firing, or?
He acted out, yes, as if he was firing. And again, it sounds strange, but he thought he was at the firing range. Dan and I both looked at each other like, wow. But you can't say anything because you don't want to interrupt what's going on.
Only one new piece of information came out with hypnosis. Not very much. And the only new information that came out was that I asked Sirhan to tell me what he saw around him when he was in range mode. He remembered seeing a flash. And I said, "Is that a flash of a gun?" He said, "Looks like that." And he heard the sound of a gun in a different clock position for where he was shooting from. And I said, "What about your gun? Is that your gun?" He said, "My gun doesn't flash." So he actually saw another flash of a gun, but he didn't remember it. We discovered this range mode behavior, and Sirhan actually, during one of the recall sessions in pre-recall, remembered the name of the firing range. It's called the Corona firing range. And I actually looked on the internet and found out that it still exists. And we found out that Sirhan actually had signed in there on a regular basis and was trained to shoot on command. In fact, he signed in the weekend before the assassination occurred, so he was trained right up to the last minute at that firing range. And this man, Frankie, who hired him for the ranch, was the man who brought him there. He remembered that part too. And then Frankie disappeared. He never saw Frankie after that. But Frankie set him up to have the fall on the horse, and probably by drugging him. And Frankie was the person who brought him to this place where they trained him to shoot on command.
And who was Frankie?
Frankie is an alias. His name was Frankie Donorama, otherwise known as Henry Ramostella. And he was one of the lieutenants under the mafia boss, Mo Dalitz, from the Detroit Purple Gang.
So what gave you the clue about shoot on command? If you could just go into that in a little more detail about the targets in the notebook and the shoot on command.
Because it was in his notebook, so I simply asked him about it, whether anybody ever gave him instructions to shoot on command, and he said yes, and that's when he jumped up and did range mode. It was witnessed by both his attorney, Laurie Dusek, and myself on more than one occasion, and we found after a while that we could actually trigger it. If you tap him on the shoulder twice like this, which is a typical hypnotic, he gets up like this, he goes, and he starts spouting military technical terms about which vital human organ you shoot at. And then, but in his mind, he's shooting at circle targets at a firing range. Sirhan had a gun. He had an Ivor .22 pistol, and he loved going to the shooting range and firing on a regular basis. So this was not incongruent behavior for him. It was something that he did on a regular basis. But in this context, he was trained to shoot at vital human organs, and to shoot upon cue, and to go into range mode upon cue. So highly learned behavior under hypnosis, presumably.
So what was the significance of him shooting at circle targets rather than shooting at Bobby Kennedy in terms of the programming?
Well, in the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a lot of research on whether you can get people to do things under hypnosis that would violate their moral standards. If you distorted the reality of the information, of the situation, so it didn't seem like they were really doing something against their standards. Like, for example, there was a famous case in Australia of a hypnotic seduction. And the hypnotist would tell women that they were on an isolated beach all by themselves, and it was really hot, and it was fine to take their clothes off. And it didn't seem like there was anything wrong under the context that he was creating for them. Or in this case, if Sirhan loved to shoot at the firing range, to simply suggest to him that he could do that upon cue and direct it in a certain way towards targets. But in his mind, he was thinking that he was shooting at circle targets, and he didn't think there was anything wrong with that. So you can distort the situation significantly to get people to do things that would normally be violation of their moral standards, because they don't think they're violating their moral standards. But even so, you can only do that with very people who are highly suggestible, who are highly compliant, and who are somewhat dissociative. He has all three personality markers for this.
And during this kind of range mode, did he ever mention Bobby Kennedy or utter any words at all? Or?
The only time he mentioned that was that when he was reconstructing his memory for what happened in the night of this assassination. He remembers going into range mode and having the girl with the polka dot dress tap his arm, and then somebody jumped him and was holding him down by the neck, and he said, "Oh my God, I wasn't shooting at a firing range. I just shot somebody." He had no idea who he shot, or that he was even in a hotel room. He just remembered being at the firing range.
You usually can't convince somebody on hypnosis to do something that they don't want to do, but if you twist it a little bit, Sirhan wouldn't have shot at a human, but if you convinced him it was a target, you know, you could just put a little spin on what you asked somebody to do, and that's what happened. It sounds, again, far-fetched, but there have been studies on this, and people have done it. And in his notebook, there's a lot about, and the master said. Well, under hypnosis, Sirhan talks a lot about the range master at the Corona range. He was fascinated with the man. And he felt, under hypnosis, he said, I knew I was safe with him. I knew if I needed something, I could go to him. Why? And nobody ever looked into that. After the injury, Sirhan's eyes were bothering him, so he went to a doctor in Pasadena, and the doctor put eye drops in his eyes. And Sirhan had borrowed somebody's car to get to the doctor's, and because his eyes were blurry, he didn't want to drive the car. So he left the doctor's office, and right there was a coffee shop, and he went in. Sirhan had a shortwave radio. He had purchased it from his next-door neighbors, 2 women. It was a World War II shortwave radio. He didn't send messages on it, but he listened into the shortwave radio every evening. So sitting at the counter in this coffee shop was a man with a brand new Sony shortwave radio. And Sirhan just thought that was strange. But he was fascinated with the Sony shortwave. So they started talking. And the gentleman started talking about anti-government matters, and was smoking a pipe, blowing smoke into Sirhan's face.
There was a man, unusual man, which we named Radio Man, who had a turned-down handlebar mustache, horn-rimmed glasses, and spoke in a foreign accent. He said like a Cajun accent. And this man had a shortwave radio set up in the diner, the coffee shop, which was very unusual.
Next visit to the doctor, again eye drops were applied. And I sometimes wonder what were in the eye drops. But eye drops were applied, and again he went back to the coffee shop, and who's sitting there? What we now call the Radio Man. And the first time he had told Sirhan that he was working on a thesis, and that he would like Sirhan to read it. So Sirhan was a little confused because this guy was not a professor and too old to be a college student. He had a strange mustache, and he spoke with almost like a Cajun accent. So Sirhan stepped out on the street with this guy the second time, and this guy showed him his paper, and it was anti-government. And when asked what, he said it was anti-Nixon, anti-LBJ, but there was no mention of RFK. And he said he thought that this guy was just crazy.
And he said that this person was raving on about anti-government stuff, about killing off government officials. And he said that's where the ideas came to him about killing off government officials. They came from this man named Radio Man. And every time he went to the eye doctor, he would visit Radio Man again, and because he would be set up in this diner. It turns out that the Saturday before the assassination, Sirhan had actually signed into this Corona firing range for some last-minute training, and he was with a man that they described as having a foreign accent and a turned-down handlebar mustache, but he refused to sign his name. He wouldn't sign in. So we don't know who he was. But that's where Sirhan got the ideas from about killing government officials. He said they were suggested to him. I could never get him to remember anything about what happened the weekend before the assassination. But if I take the Google Maps and I take the mileage from his place in Pasadena to Corona firing range, it looks like he made 3 trips. It almost matches exactly the mileage on his car. He signed in at least one of those trips. So we know he went there at least once and probably more than once. Given the fact that he may have been at this firing range most of that weekend practicing range mode, then what was unclear to me is what he did the rest of the weekend. So I just casually asked him one time, well, what did you do nights? And he said, I played on my shortwave radio. And then he starts tapping out Morse code. He was tapping out certain signals and not even know that he was tapping them out unconsciously. So I thought, well, maybe that explains the writing of his notebooks.
We asked him what channels he would listen to on his shortwave radio, and he'd listen to channels like America, Freedom America. He'd listen to channels from the Middle East. He'd listen to channels from Europe. And then he said that there was one channel that he listened to every night, and it was a Morse code. And he said it was so clear, and that it had to be right nearby. And he said he didn't know Morse code. And it bothered me. And I started talking to Dan about it. So Dan we managed to get the prison to allow us to bring an MP3 player in.
So what I did is I took his notebooks and I took 10 neutral statements about things that he wrote in the notebooks, and then 10 inculpatory statements like range master says shoot on command, RFK must die. And I found a program on the computer where I could take those statements and type them into Morse code, and I randomized them. And it took a while to get permission from the prison to bring in a audio playback that I could play him. So I just gave him a pen and put it in his hand, and didn't say anything else. And then when I talked to him about other things, I played on the Morse code in the background. And sure enough, when the inculpatory statements came up in Morse code, he would write down inculpatory statements. Not the same ones, but he would write down things like killing a government official and things like that. I even put in a couple of dummy things about killing contemporary people, and he wrote them down. So you can get him under hypnosis to do automatic writing. It's one of the features of a high hypnotizable. And the hand is dissociated. He doesn't even know the hand is writing. So it looked like all of those notebooks were things that were suggested to him on over the shortwave radio as Morse code. He never even knew what he was writing down.
Not being hypnotized, Sirhan had no concept what Morse code was. Under hypnosis, he started writing the replies from the Morse code. And then what I would do is, because he just kept writing, I would move the paper so that he wouldn't write over what he had already written. It was fascinating to watch.
When you were talking to Sirhan about this, he was under hypnosis at the time?
No, it didn't even bother him. He's so hypnotizable, he just goes into trance upon cue. You don't even have to hypnotize him. All I had to do is put the pen in his hand and over a piece of paper, and he'll just start writing automatically. He doesn't even know he's writing. It's quite dramatic. I wish I could have filmed it.
So you're talking to him normally?
About something else. I was talking about nature, something like that. And he was writing about whatever the Morse code was saying. He was writing it down, not word for word, but the gist of it.
And so the Morse code makes him go into trance, or he does it subconsciously?
Yeah.
It makes him go into trance?
Yeah.
The actual Morse code sound?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then when he was brought out of the state, he just looked at us and said, "No, guys, this is crazy." He himself can't grasp the concept of the Manchurian Candidate. He can't. But he also can't explain why he can't remember.
That may sound fairly fantastic, but I did interview his brother Munir, and his brother said it was true that he could hear Morse code in the background because Sirhan played with his shortwave radio mostly every night, including the weekend before the assassination, and that he mostly was listening to Morse code. So these notebooks were actually shaped before the assassination, and he wrote down the statements probably before he even was involved in the assassination, just so to make sure that he would be incriminated at trial. So we would call that a involuntary confession.
The first time that Dan and I met Sirhan together, he mentioned the radio man. He didn't call him the radio man, but he mentioned the fact that he met this guy and the radio. And it took us 2 years before we figured out, or thought we had figured out, the radio man and Morse code. And to see Sirhan, who said he doesn't know Morse code, under hypnosis being able to decipher Morse code. So I honestly believe that notebook was dictated to him via the Morse code.
That may seem fantastic, but you have to remember the historic context of this. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. government was concerned about, particularly the Soviets involving themselves in brainwashing of people in the Moscow show trials in the 1930s and 40s. And then in the Korean War, of course, a number of American troops were captured and brainwashed and reverted to a communist ideology. 95% of them reverted back to their original ideology within 3 weeks of leaving the prison camps, but 5% never did. So there's about 5% of people who are unduly suggestible, and they are highly vulnerable to suggestive influence. And that, in order to keep up with the Soviets and the Russians, particularly under Allen Dulles, the CIA was involved in secret mind control experiments in the 1950s and 60s. They got caught for it. One experiment they got caught for that was embarrassing to them was at William Allison Memorial White Hospital in Montreal. And they were taking outpatients, kidnapping them, putting them on an inpatient unit, strapping them down, and playing the same tape loop over and over again to erase the mind, giving them LSD and giving them hypnotic suggestions, a combination of sensory deprivation, LSD, and hypnosis. They were so above the law that they would take anybody. There were several subjects who were kidnapped who were spouses of Canadian cabinet members. They did whatever they wanted to do. So we know that they used a combination of hypnosis and psychedelic drugs and sensory deprivation. So we know that that research was being done in several research centers in the 1960s and early 70s about mind control under a project called MK Ultra that the CIA was involved in. And in fact, I had worked at Maryland Psychiatric Research Center in 1971, and there was a lab there by John Lennox, who did work on hypnosis and sensory deprivation and hallucinogens. And we later found out that the whole research center was funded by the CIA. This was one of their sites. None of us knew that at the time. One of the other sites was run by Jolly West, the head of the psychiatry department at UCLA. And he had a lab in the San Bernardino Mountains where they worked on mind control experiments. So he would be the more likely candidate to be the person to have programmed Sirhan. So at one point I gave Sirhan a picture of Jolly West and 5 other dummy pictures, and he immediately pointed out to Jolly West and said, "This guy's familiar to me," but he couldn't say why, so it wasn't a full identification. It actually started in with the OSS before the CIA, and when they were doing work in the 1940s, there was a hypnotist by the name of George Estabrooks who worked for them for quite a number of years and claimed that he could make alternate personality states that could be made to kill and to send unconscious messages they didn't know they were sending. So, and some of those messages were sent to Morse code. So we know that this was the zeitgeist of the time. A good friend of mine and colleague, a law professor, Alan Shefflin, sued the government under the Freedom of Information Act and has collected a number of the files from the CIA about their experiments, and we've read several cases where there were successful hits of assassinating minor officials, government officials in other countries through hypnotic programming and mind control. And there's extensive documents that we've seen on what are called hypnotic couriers sending messages through covert means like Morse code and things like that that the person didn't know they were carrying. So the idea that Sirhan's own confession would have been shaped by himself without knowing it through Morse code may sound fantastic, but it's very much consistent with the practices of those times in the mid to late 1960s.
And can you explain to the layperson what an altered personality state is?
It's something that's produced by suggestive influence and to respond only at certain cues upon command, and then the person doesn't know that they have, like range mode. Unless you know the cue, you can't open it and get the person to act that way. But if you know the cue, you can get them to act on it, and they often don't remember anything that they do in that state. Which is why Sirhan doesn't remember anything other than showing up there and then somebody pinning him down. Doesn't remember other than that. He thinks he's still shot at a fire circle targets at a firing range. One of the things that's missing in this case is no one's ever considered the mafia connections. Bobby Kennedy was going after organized crime in this country, and the man he targeted was primarily the Detroit Purple Gang boss, Mo Dalitz, and his good friend Jimmy Hoffa. Now that has a long family history, because Joe Kennedy in Somerset Company was a rum runner during the Prohibition years. That's where the family made their fortune. At one point, Joe tried to open up territory in New Jersey, and he ran afoul of the local mafia boss at the time, who happened to be Mo Dalitz. Mo Dalitz took a contract out on Joe, and the Chicago mafia boss, Giancarlo, paid the hit off to keep Joe alive as a friend, as a personal favor. It's not an accident that Bobby went after the same guy. And it's not an accident. No one's ever connected the dots before. Frankie Donorama, or Henry Ramostella, whatever his real name is out of New Jersey. He worked for Mo Dalitz as his assistant. That's the guy who hired Sirhan for the ranch, who he had his fall, and brought him to the firing range.
Frank was the person that took Sirhan to the hospital. Frank was the person that picked Sirhan up from the hospital. So I think Frank had a lot to do with this. Frank was responsible for Sirhan being hired at the ranch. Well, Frank had mafia connections left and right. That took us a long time to convince Sirhan that the mob was most likely involved. Well, not most likely, was involved in this. To this day, if you ask Sirhan, he goes, I don't know. And he's not going to say yes because he honestly doesn't know.
We know that J. Edgar Hoover fought Bobby at every step of the way about organized crime. We now know from Newman's research that J. Edgar Hoover had a gambling addiction. And he had privileges at Del Mar Racetrack, owned by Mo Dalitz. And he would often write off Hoover's gambling debts. So it's not an accident, I don't think, that it was just coincidental that Bobby tried to bring down organized crime and was blocked by Hoover on every occasion possible. And that Hoover is covering his own gambling addiction with Mo Dalitz, the very guy that Kennedy wanted to bring down. And that all these Mo Dalitz figures appears in this picture that I've uncovered here.
They admitted that we showed the possibility of a second gun person, but we didn't show who it was. We showed the possibility of mind control, but we didn't show who did it. That's not our job. Our job is to raise the doubt. It's the state's responsibility then to figure out who did it. We applied to the Supreme Court, we were rejected. We've exhausted all our legal recourses here. The only way that we could succeed on is if we had a civil case and we could ask for an evidentiary hearing. But that's going to cost a lot of money, and we just don't have it.
After they blocked us for a year of seeing Sirhan, we finally went to Cochrane for the first time and saw him for 2 days. And my wife and I have an apartment in San Francisco, and we live in the Boston area. So I was flying from Fresno back to San Francisco to stay overnight. And in my bags, I had all the Bernie Diamond video cassettes and a Sony Walkman. And I get on a 12-seater plane with one other passenger, and I watch the bags get put on the plane. And I wait for an hour for my bags at San Francisco Airport, and I go up to a woman from United Airlines and say, where are the bags for such and such a plane? And she says, they came on Carousel 4, the commuter carousel, 45 minutes ago. I said, no, I've been waiting at the commuter carousel for an hour. They never came in. So I filed a missing bag report, and I get the bags back 4 hours later in my apartment. They've all been searched and gone through, and they left some of the tapes running in the tape recorder. But that was just the beginning. What happened from there is that the following week I was teaching a clinical course on treating attachment disorders in children in St. Louis. It's 11 o'clock at night. And my friends, a couple who were sponsoring me, who were friends of mine, witnessed this. I'm waiting for my bags to come in, and I watch a woman from United Airlines take my bags and walk off with them. So I race after her and say, you're taking my bags. And she says, these bags are to be rerouted to the military base in San Diego. And I said, no, we have a problem here. You see, I have bag tags, and they match. And they belong to me, and what you're doing, I don't care if you work for the airlines, you're stealing my bags. Give me my bags back. And she says, no, I'm rerouting them. And I said, I'm going to start screaming, and you're going to have a security breach, and you're going to have state police and Homeland Security here, and you're going to have to explain why you're stealing my bags, unless you tell me who gave you these orders. And sure enough, in front of my friend, she says, looks on the clipboard and says, all bags associated with the Kennedy party to be rerouted to the military base. That's not subtle. For the next 2 years, every time I got on a plane, which is about every 2 weeks, my bags were stolen. That's a violation of search and seizure rights. Then I had 5 tax audits. And every time I get a different tax audit and a different IRS agent. So I had a tax lawyer working with me. And he called up a number of times to negotiate some settlement with them. What they wanted the last tax audit was original receipts at the end of the year. They wouldn't take credit card summaries for Schedule C receipts. I said, that's ridiculous. Nobody's going to do that in this country. So finally, my tax attorney is caught talking with an IRS agent, and the IRS agent says to him in confidence, he says, look, I don't understand that we've audited your guy 4 times, we never find anything. He's honest. This makes no sense to me. So he calls up my attorney the next day and says, I don't know why, but your client has a tag on his account by a top U.S. Treasury Department official that we should harass him as much as possible within the boundaries of the law for the rest of his life. I just got my 5th tax audit. It's been 11 years now of harassment. Then we submitted the case to the 9th Circuit under new evidence. The law says that they have to act in 60 days. It took 3.5 years before they denied their appeal. We sent it to the Supreme Court, and we caught the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court in a lie. The brief that we sent in, they wrote us back and said, denied, reviewed such and such a day and denied, except that the date that they reviewed it was 2 months before we sent in the brief. They can't explain that. So what kind of person has the power in this country that they can make a phone call, violate an upstanding citizen's search and seizure rights, put a tag on his IRS account for the rest of his life, and get the 9th Circuit and the Supreme Court to violate its own rules? That's scary to me. I don't know what this is all about, but certainly we're exposing something here that needs to be exposed, because I had the illusion that we actually had a democracy in this country, and I think it's worth fighting for, and passing it down to the next generation to our kids. It's still worth fighting for. We had something precious in this country, and we pissed it away. I want it back.
How you doing, Mr. Sirhan?
Good afternoon, John.
Your seat right there. This is a subsequent number 13 parole consideration hearing for Sirhan Sirhan. The inmate was received on 5/23/69 from Los Angeles County. The inmate received a term originally of the death sentence, which was reduced in August 16, 1971 to life with the possibility of parole.
I wanted to jump across the table a couple of times, and only one attorney can talk, so Bill Pepper did the talking. But I had to almost sit on my hands a few times because I was just so mad. And his parole was denied.
The panel has reviewed all the information received from the public and all relevant information that was before us today, and have concluded the prisoner is not yet suitable for parole and would pose an unreasonable risk of danger or threat to public safety if released from prison.
And I think he spoke very eloquently in 2011. He apologized for being there. He apologized for anything he had done. But he couldn't, by then he was beginning to realize that he didn't think he did it. So how could he admit something that he's got no recollection of? And for him to get out, the parole board wants him to say, yes, I did it. And he can't because he's got no recollection. So then in 2016, Sirhan told me, I can't do it. I can't take the humiliation anymore. I'm not going to appear. And I told him that Paul Schrade was going to be there. And he said to me, Laurie, you've said that to me before. And I said, no, this time it's for real. So finally he said yes. Paul spoke eloquently. I love Paul. He's such a brilliant man, and he has given so much effort into not only trying to help Sirhan, but to find what happened to his friend, Senator Kennedy. He was appalled at the way they treated Sirhan in that hearing. If you just look at the physical evidence, if you look at the ballistics, if you look at the autopsy report, there's no way that Sirhan could have shot the senator. So even if you don't believe in the Manchurian Candidate aspect of this, but you just look at the hard, cold facts, Sirhan did not kill the senator. And Paul felt guilty that he hadn't come forward sooner. Because with Paul Schrade being part of this, we had more press than we would have gotten without. But Paul did say to Sirhan, I'm sorry, I should have been here sooner. And Paul does feel guilty about that. But he shouldn't, because he's done more than just about anybody trying to get to the truth. Sirhan was deeply touched by what Paul had to say. When he went to try to shake Sirhan's hand at the end, they wouldn't let him. Was Sirhan surprised that his parole was denied? No. Was I surprised? No. I was angry. And then after the hearing, they ransacked his cell. When he went upstairs to his cell, his bed was on the floor and all his personal belongings were scattered around his cell. And that's not done by an inmate, that's done by a guard. Because he has his own individual cell. Why? Why are they trying to intimidate him? I don't know if I'm going to be able to get Sirhan to another parole hearing because he feels so humiliated being there. And then they intimidate him prior to the parole hearing, and then they intimidate him afterwards. And he says after a parole hearing, he just goes into a funk for days. How he has kept his spirits up all this time, I could just say it's his belief in God.
What is your favorite book of the New Testament?
Oh, I think the whole Bible is my favorite book, but I would say maybe Psalms. I like
That's
the Psalms.
the Old Testament. The New Testament is.
The New Testament, I like that expression in Luke 4:16 to 23. I like that very much because it instills and renews my hope that sooner or later I will be found suitable for parole and get out, because Christ promised that to all the believers.
I've had the most contact with Sirhan over the last 11 years than anybody outside of prison. I've become very fond of him and protective, because he doesn't really have anybody else to do that for him. People think that Sirhan's a monster or that he's already dead. For some reason, people think that because he's from the Middle East, he's a Muslim. He's not. He's a devout Christian. And at one of the parole boards, they asked him, well, you have a Quran. Why? As if it was a crime to have a Quran. And he said, because it helps me stay fluent in Arabic. After 9/11, he was put into solitary confinement for 6 years. He said to me, the towers hadn't even turned to dust, and they took me out. How many years had he been under custody of the state of California? And they thought he was involved with 9/11? Ludicrous. There's really no justice. And if there's no justice in a case that's so well known, I'm concerned about what happens to the average person. They're going to keep Sirhan in jail until he dies. That's their intent. And he should have been paroled in 1980. 82, I think. The state psychologists do not think he's a threat. He's had no problems in jail. He's been a model prisoner. Dan has done psychological tests on him that match the tests that were done by the prison psychologist, and yet he's still being held.
What more work is there that you need to do with Sirhan in the prison, if any?
I don't think he's going to remember much more than that I was able to get out of him for the last 11 years. I think the issue here is trying to appeal to the proper authorities to open up the case of a man who's been in jail for 48 years for something he didn't do.
Sirhan will not push anybody in front of the bus. When we talked to him about the polka dot dress girl having a part, he defends her. He's getting to the realization now that somebody had to be involved, but he's not pointing a finger at anybody because, as he says, I don't know. And I don't think he wants done to somebody what was done to him. He believes that it's a possibility that somebody hypnotized him or somebody did something to him for this to have happened. I know that sounds strange because when you talk about the Manchurian Candidate, people don't buy it. And I don't understand why, because there's enough proof out there now that the government was involved in experiments like that. So if that was done, why is it so hard to believe that Sirhan couldn't have been a Manchurian Candidate?
So what's left to do with Sirhan? What more work can you do with him?
I need to get the story out now so that people will begin to look into it. I think we know a lot. I think that it's clear that Sirhan was not the sole assassin. He's innocent of that. He was there to be a distractor and to take the rap. I think we know that there was a cover-up that both the LAPD chief of police and the DA's office participated in. I think we know that the mafia had some involvement in this, and J. Edgar Hoover had some direct involvement in it, but it goes far beyond Hoover if he was also killed. So how far up it goes, the further up you go, the less the paper trail. But I think that what should happen is the proper law enforcement agents should be involved in investigating this and reopening it.
The prison won't allow a video interview of him. We could do an audio via telephone. But as he said to me in June, he said, "Lori, I've already said everything I have to say. I don't have anything else to add because I don't remember." And he goes, "And I trust you to speak on my behalf." Sirhan now works in the kitchen. He basically stays by himself. He said he used to read a lot, but he doesn't read much anymore. He listens to a radio, he's got a TV, and he tries to exercise. People think that you get paid for doing this. I don't get paid. Money comes out of my pocket, and I spend time on this that I could be investing in something else. I gave my word to Munir and Sirhan, not that we'd win, but that I wouldn't give up. And over the years, I'm fond of Sirhan, but I really look upon Munir as a friend. He's a really great guy. And when people see this, they don't understand that it's not just the Kennedy family that suffered, the Sirhan family. I mean, Munir, this has been 50 years of Munir's life, and he's the last relative that Sirhan has. Does it impact Munir? Greatly. So 2 families have suffered. 2 families have lost a family member. Yes, the senator is dead, but Sirhan's been incarcerated for 50 years. And I gave my word, and I just think that you're as good as your word, and I'm not going to give up.
I would say that personally I never expected in a million years that I would be attacked by my own government for my investigation in this case. That's been the hardest pill to swallow. But I'm feisty. I'm not about to roll over and play dead because people intimidate me. I think that this country had a precious democracy. I want to keep it going.
Now you owe me one. And if you don't pay me when you owe me, then I'm going to pay you what you owe me. You see what I'm saying?